What is levirate marriage? It has nothing to do with the tribe of Levi, but comes from the Latin word levir, meaning a husband's brother or brother-in-law. In an extended household where brothers live together, if one brother died without leaving a male heir, the other brother was to marry the dead brother's widow. The first son she gave birth to was regarded as the son and heir of the dead brother. This was to preserve the name of the man who died before having a son. Certain sections of the Indian population have a tradition of widow remarriage. Girjans and several castes in Uttar Pradesh and among the Kodagu of Mysore. In a levirate marriage, a man is obliged to marry the widow. Levirate alliances have been reported among the Ahirs of Haryana, some Jats, and of a brother. The Kasi rules of marriage allow the matrilateral cross-cousin marriage, but levirate, marriage of a widow with a husband's brother, or sororate, marriage of a widower with his wife's sister, marriages are not allowed. They do not also practice hypergamy, that is, woman's marriage into a group higher in status than her own group. Polygyny, a man's marriage to more than one spouse at a time, as well as polyandry, a woman's marriage to more than one spouse at a time, are unknown among the Kasi. A man may have a mistress. Among some sections of the Kasi, children from his mistress equally share inheritance rights to the father's property if any is acquired by him with other children in the family. India. While levirate marriages were rather common in rural India, the practice is currently seen only in a few parts of the country such as Punjab and Haryana. It is thought that the tradition dates back centuries in societies that did not provide any work opportunities for women outside of the home. The women did not have the option of remarrying or going back to their parents' house. Therefore, the practice allowed widows a chance to keep any land or property owned by the deceased husband in the family. If a widow did not have any male progeny and a levirate marriage was not possible, the woman would be forced to adopt a nephew of her husband. A more common practice saw that the widow was married to an unmarried younger brother. Low-key ceremonies were held where families from both the widow and the husband's side gathered. Today, this type of marriage arrangement is only seen in remote rural regions. Africa. Africa also acknowledges levirate marriages. In Somalia, the practice is seen where provision are made under Somali customary law to determine the bride price, an amount of money or property that determines the perceived value of a woman. In northern Cameroon, the Mambila recognize the inheritance of wives where levirate marriages are practiced throughout the tribe. In western Kenya, Maragoli widows would remarry to the brother of their deceased husband. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria commonly practice the act of women marrying the brother of her deceased husband if she had children. This act allowed the kids to keep the identity and inheritance of their father's family. While it is not as commonplace today, the practice is still alive. The Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa Fulani embrace the custom. In South Africa, the levirate marriage was called Ukungena and was upheld mostly in the past. As an increase of women's rights awareness had spread through the countries, the number of women that follow the obligation to enter such a union has fallen. Some of the last cultures to follow the custom was the Zulu, who once heavily believed in levirate unions and the ghost marriage, which meant that a deceased groom was replaced by his brother. Historical records show that levirate unions took place in the United Kingdom as a way to preserve alliances that were created through marriage. This was perceived as a method of protecting the social status of royal spouses. For example, after Arthur, the Prince of Wales, died, his widow, Catherine of Aragon, was allowed to marry his younger brother, who happened to be the future Henry VIII. This type of marriage also took place between Mary of Teck and the future George V following the death of his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Understanding the purpose of the levirate marriage and its symbolism. One of the ancient institutions that have persisted since archaic times is the levirate marriage. Here is a brief synopsis of the institution and its underlying rationale. Life of a widow in the ancient world was precarious at best. Having no inheritance rights, she was easily exploited and was frequently reduced to abject poverty and prostitution. Many ancient civilizations from India, Africa to the ancient Near East utilized the levirate marriage as a means of protecting the brother's wife from being exposed to poverty. Society expected the surviving brother of a deceased man who lacked an heir to marry the widow. It is interesting to note that according to the Kabbalah and Hindu folklore, the soul of the dead brother is reincarnated in the body of child his wife is carrying. The offspring from their marriage were considered children and heirs of the deceased. In a society that defined the importance of a woman in terms of her ability to bear and raise children, the levirate marriage enabled a woman to be fulfilled. This law served to guarantee the deceased brother's wife a place in her husband's family and protected her from exploitation. This law was consistent with the biblical ethos calling upon the community of God to remember and care for the sojourners, the fatherless, and the widow. During the early period of Israelite history, this practice was not considered optional but a duty to be faithfully carried out. For the brother-in-law, the levirate marriage was not without its downside. By observing the law, he could actually damage his own estate, for it could be either diminished as a result of siring a son who would co-inherit with him. Likewise, it would be his to take responsibility for the widow as well as managing his dead brother's land, not to mention and be financially responsible for his sister-in-law as his wife. However, families took great pride in providing care for all its members. The duty to take care of the widow was considered to be a morally important duty not to be casually disregarded. Performance of the levirate was considered by ancients to be a truly magnanimous act on the part of the living brother. He was assuming obligations without necessarily deriving any corresponding benefits. It was an act of kindness not only to the widow, but it also witnessed to the dignity of the deceased individual, for his name would be perpetuated among his people. The sacred biblical framers realized that not every person would be willing to observe the institution described above. A mechanism was set in motion that would allow the widow to remarry anyone of her choosing, but she could not do so without the assistance of her brother-in-law. A special ceremony known as halitza provided the means by which a brother-in-law releases himself of the obligation to marry his deceased brother's wife should the brother have died before producing offspring. The ceremony involves taking of the brother-in-law's shoe as he hands it to his deceased brother's wife to release her from the duty of marrying him in order to produce a name for his brother. The woman is then free to marry whomever she chooses. In Deuteronomy, the law reads, "Then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and shall spit in his face." Quite literally. Commentaries softened the text to mean that she should spit toward him. In the story of Ruth, her liver removed his shoes, and by doing so, removed any interest that he would have in taking care of Ruth's land and household. This enabled Boaz to become the next in line to perform the levirate marriage. A widow removed his authorization to administer the land of her household. Spitting among Bedouin Arabs is still often a cause of blood feud. Since antiquity, macho societies of the Near East considered being spat by a woman is even a greater dishonor and humiliation. Nevertheless, in this case, the Torah protects the women, and there is nothing the kinsman can do. But why the humiliation? The purpose is to embarrass the liver for not carrying out his duty in front of the community, which was held at the entrance chamber of the city, where all the town officials and magistrates sat. In an honor-based society, where pride and respect are qualities men will fight and die for, the ceremony described must have had a sobering effect on a society which placed the good and welfare of the family over that of the individual. Only a selflessly devoted man who had no interest in personally profiting from the deceased's estate would be willing to raise a son whose name would perpetuate the deceased and not his own. Thus, the failure to observe this law reflected a lack of brotherly concern and was looked upon with contempt by the widow. The pulling off of his shoe was meant to embarrass the next of kin. Recent trends. Levirate was quite common in rural India until as recently as a few years ago, and is still practiced in certain parts of Punjab and Haryana. It is called latta odna in the Jats of Haryana, latta being the Haryanvi word for a cloth that women used to cover their heads and faces, and odna translating as covering or wearing. This is also called chadar dakna. In other parts, chadar being Hindi for latta and dakna being Hindi for odna. The practice probably originated centuries ago in agrarian societies where vocational opportunities for women other than working at home were non-existent. Remarriage or going back to the parents' home was not an option. The practice ensured and continues to do so that any land or property owned by the deceased husband would continue to stay in his family. If the widow did not have any male progeny and a levirate was not possible, she would be made to adopt a nephew of her husband. The more common practice was for the widow to be married off to an unmarried younger brother, a custom referred to as niyoga. The ceremony was generally a low-key affair where families from both the widow and the husband's side got together and came to the decision without any of the fanfare that was generally associated with weddings. In recent years, the levirate has all but disappeared except from the remote rural areas. Such marriages still take place in both rural and urban Bangladesh, especially in the lower and middle income groups. Sororate. This term was introduced by Sir James Fraser to designate all marriages with a wife's sister, whether in the lifetime of the first wife or after her death. In his view, it is complementary to the custom of the levirate, and both are offshoots from one common root, a system of group marriage in which all the husbands were brothers and all the wives were sisters to each other, though not to their husbands, and that system in its turn originated in a simple desire to get wives as easily and cheaply as possible. It is to be noted that in cases where fraternal polyandry is permitted, the wife of the eldest brother is the common wife, while the wife of the youngest brother belongs to him alone, and that in societies where a definite relation as the cross cousin is prescribed for the eldest son, the youngest son is free to marry whom he will or can within the more general rules of exogamy, so that the wives of the younger brothers in such cases do not or may not possess the status required for the wife of the eldest brother, while the younger sister of the late wife would possess that status. In the case of the matrilineal garros, marriage with a prescribed relative, the cross cousin, the son of a woman's mother's brother, is binding only on the youngest daughter. No rights are conferred by marriage with the elder daughters. It is further to be noted that as with the Balla, the Illa-speaking people, a woman though married may be called to leave her husband and her children to become the wife of her late sister's husband under the sororate regulation. In India, it is generally the wife's younger sister who is taken as a second wife when the first wife is barren or suffers from an incurable disease. In advanced communities, marriage with the deceased wife's sister occurs for practical reasons when there are young children to be brought up. In primitive communities, the relationship created by the first marriage between the two families is marked by a series of obligations of an economic, religious, and social nature, so that there is clearly an advantage in maintaining the existing mode of relationship over the creation of a new series of an analogous obligations. Thus, in Ashanti, in the case of chiefs, when a wife dies, the family are expected to replace the deceased woman by giving her sister in marriage to the chief. Surrogate marriage. Surrogate marriage is a type of marriage in which a husband engages in marriage or sexual relations with a sister of his wife, usually after the death of his wife or once his wife has proven infertile. From an anthropological standpoint, this type of marriage strengthens the ties between both groups, the wife's family or clan and the husband's, and preserves the contract between the two to provide children and continue the alliance. It is seen among some European American families, although it is not an imperative tradition. The Athabaskan-speaking Inuit people, formerly known as Eskimos, of northern Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, follow or followed this custom. It is also followed by the Chickasaw group of the Western Apache, who are Athabaskan speaking, as is levirate marriage. Surrogate marriage is also practiced by the Sioux, Lakota tribes and some Western Mono tribes in California, such as the Waxahachie or Waxahachie. Surrogate marriage is also practiced by the Swazi people and for the same reasons as stated. This type of marriage is also made in Bhutan. The former king Jigme Singh Wangchuck, the current king's father, is married to 4 wives, all of whom are sisters. There is also evidence that surrogate marriage existed in ancient China. Levirate marriage and junior surrogate marriage are permitted for the Hindu Baniya caste. Levirate marriage was encouraged among the ancient Jewish cultures. To conclude, levirate marriage can, at its most positive, serve as protection for the widow and her children, ensuring that they have a male provider responsible for them. This can be a positive in a society where women are not allowed self-sufficiency and must rely on a man to provide, especially in societies where women are seen as under the authority, dependent on, servitude and or possession of their husband. Thus, practice of levirate marriage is strongly associated with patriarchal societies. The practice was extremely important in ancient societies. Example, history of ancient Arab Near East, and remains so today in parts of the world. Having children enabled the inheritance of land, which offered security and status. A levirate marriage might only occur if a man died childless in order to continue his family line.